Dear Evelyn, if you haven't seen Big Fish, it tells the tale of Edward Bloom, a storyteller, and his son Will, who no longer believes his father's stories. Edward Bloom is dying, and he narrates his younger life in a series of fantastical anecdotes that span from tales of befriending giants, coming across a lost village called Spectre, meeting the poet laureate come bank robber of Spectre, performing in the circus, fighting in World War II, and meeting Siamese twins. And the story that runs through it all is his love for his wife, Sandra. Edward spends most of his later life telling these stories to enraptured audiences, but his son Will is a journalist who believes that each of these adventures are utter lies. Will wants to know his dad and who he really is. In the final days before his death, he wants his dad to tell him the truth. Edward, of course, holds that these impossible stories are the truth. So I've been wondering what the purpose is of the stories we tell. Everyone emblazons their stories with half-truths and exaggerations. At what point do these stories stop being true and start being fantasy? Or is it the case that these embellishments add a new kind of truth? I would argue that stories have two primary functions. They inform us about the attitudes and intended messages of the author, and in a bigger way, they inform us about the human condition within the social context of the story being told. After all, Edward Bloom's stories are much more about his character than they are about his life. To take the first function, historical stories often had a propagandist element to them. For instance, the famous story of Marie Antoinette, not long before the French Revolution, can be recited by most children even today, or specifically her words upon learning that the French peasants had no bread to eat. Let them eat cake. Of course, there's no evidence that Marie Antoinette said anything of the sort. The saying seems to have originated from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's book Confessions, written when Antoinette was only a child. But the deliberate misattribution to Antoinette tells us much more about the storytellers than Antoinette herself. The aim was clearly to project a certain ignorant and privileged image of the ruling classes by pro-revolutionary historians. In a tale a few years later, we have another example. In the Battle of Copenhagen in 1801, so the story goes, Nelson was in fierce ship-to-ship fighting near the front. Seeing the danger and knowing that Nelson couldn't retreat without an order to do so, Admiral Parker sent up the flag to retreat. Upon the flag being pointed out to him, Nelson put the telescope to his blind eye and famously declared, "I see no flag." Great, heroic, and massively misleading. Whilst most of the elements of this story are true, it is also true that Nelson's ship, the Agamemnon, was grounded at that moment and incapable of retreat. This part of the tale is often not told, of course, because the aim then, perhaps as much as it is now, was to paint Nelson as the heroic and fearless leader, and he may well have been. But in reality, this story doesn't tell us about the character of Nelson. Instead, it tells us about the aims of the storytellers. Edward Bloom's stories, of course, are about himself, and often portray him as the dashing hero. Perhaps they tell us more about the man he saw himself to be than the man he actually was. We are always, are we not, exaggerated in our confidence or cowardice, in our wit or charming folly, when we feature in our own stories. But Edward Bloom exaggerates all of the characters in his stories. They are literally larger than life. But that's not to say that they were not alive. Perhaps stories also tell us about what it was like to be alive at the time the story was being told. Whilst the facts might not be correct, perhaps Nelson was a fearless commander and Marie Antoinette really did have no idea of the suffering of the French people. Every culture has its own myths, larger than mere stories, running through their literary veins, often untrue, but often indicative of the values and ethos of that culture. The epic poems of Homer give us an insight into the values of heroic age Greece, valuing Achilles, swift of foot, the warrior, a hero because he kills and demands his lot from kings, Agamemnon again, but the original this time. The Anglo-Saxon epic poem Beowulf similarly conveys to us the virtues of rugged manliness valued in their times. The titular character wrestles the monster with his own bare hands. Whereas the Elizabethan playwright Shakespeare, you may have heard of him, prizes the virtue of passionate love over that of brute strength. Our central characters in his most famous play, Romeo and Juliet, are the starstruck lovers, not the brutal fighters that surround them on both sides. I must wonder now what our own stories and myths will say about us when those of the future pick up 21st century novels and films. Would we be seen as valuing the barbaric virtues of the warrior but only in a technosuit, or Shakespearean, romantic and frivolous love? The answer is neither, or both. The answer is that we cannot understand any particular culture based upon one or two of its myths. It's bigger than that. As Carl Jung argues, myths are the expression of the collective unconscious. They express archetypes that are universal to the human experience. That's why so many myths are so similar, so familiar. Stories are essential to understanding the human character, because the human story cannot be expressed in simple, factual terms, because it's more complicated than that. Edward Bloom's stories may not be correct, but that doesn't mean they're not true. It is only once Will has accepted his father's stories that we meet the real characters at the funeral, each one of them an authentic version of their mythical selves. Yet we feel we already know them, for perhaps the human truth can only be expressed through stories. Perhaps stories give us genuine authenticity. Sweet dreams.